Good evening, and welcome to another edition of Mental Health Mondays. Today, we come to you again dealing with the topic, the real on racism. We are joined today once again by our resident expert, Dr. Quentin Moss, founder, chief, and CEO and chief medical director of Modern Psychiatry. Good evening.
Good evening, my brother. Good to be here.
And once again, we are sponsored and brought to you by Saving Grace Community Church in Grace House, Cincinnati, a ministry and nonprofit of Saving Grace Community Church. Dr. Moss, it has really been a fascinating series and month as we have dealt with a very heavy subject, the real on racism. Our discussions have taken us places that have just reminded us all how relevant and still much prevalent is racism in our nation, in our world today. And so today we wanted to talk and deal specifically with the Charleston shootings that occurred a few years back at Mother Emanuel Church. And we hope to be joined very shortly by one of those a son of a victim of that shooting. But we just want to talk about, as we think about the church, we know that the church is a place where we come together and we worship God. The church is a place where we seek forgiveness and healing and encouragement. The church is a place that we are given instruction on how to deal with our personal struggles and our issues. And it's a place that is where salvation is offered. Very oftentimes where our eternal ticket is punched for heaven and our eternal ticket for hell is canceled. It's a place that we find ourselves and we go. It's a place for a lot of things. It is a place of refuge. It is a place for restoration. It is a house of mercy. It is the house of bread. It's a place that we come and we celebrate God and of all the attributes and characteristics of God. Yes. And we honor him with the clapping of our hands, with the lifting of our voices, and we praise him because of his wonderful acts, those great things, and just the simple things that he allows us to do.
That's right.
To the divine partnership of grace and mercy, just to wake up in the morning.
That's right.
And be started on our way. But when we think about the church and all that it represents, one of the things that we don't like or would never think about or consider the church being is a crime scene for a murder. Our nation has suffered and had to endure some very horrific things, even throughout the past century. The world wars, the bombing of Pearl Harbor certainly was a horrific event, and many of the travesties that have occurred in our nation have been race-related. Certainly, 1955. The 14-year-old young man by the name of Emmett Till, who was murdered for allegedly whistling at a grown white woman. Of course, we know the bus boycott that occurred. We know about Bloody Sunday, what happened when those marchers marched across the Pettus Bridge. In the 60s in particular were just very chaotic in a time that when we look at the events during that time, there's some semblance of kind of the chaos that we've experienced in recent history. But all sorts of tragedies happened in the 60s. There was the assassination of John F. Kennedy. There were the church bombings that killed 4 little Black girls in Birmingham, Alabama. There was the assassination of Dr. King and Robert Kennedy. So the 60s was a very turbulent time. And throughout our nation's history, we've continued to have to endure a lot. The Black church has been the target and has been a channel and has been a target for those who harbor hatred in their heart to unleash it on the church. And when we look at the decade of the 90s, there were a lot of church burnings, almost 35 burnings of African American churches throughout the nation.
Wow.
Horrific and terrible. And when we look on our nation's timeline and we look down through the corridor of time and we focus on things that have happened, we can agree that June 15th, that is June 15th, 2017, was such a day that gripped our nation in fear, that caused us all great pause and to wonder that, is it really true that this is the land of the free and the home of the brave? It calls us to wonder if we could sing "My Country 'Tis of Thee, Sweet Land of Liberty, of Thee I See." It caused us to call into question once again, was a nation, a place indivisible with liberty and justice for all? It calls us to wonder. And on that horrific day where white supremacist Dylan Roof unleashed his hatred on this unsuspecting church, this was the tenor and the mood of our nation, captured by CBS on that day.
As the president looked for words to comfort the nation today, he found them in a eulogy delivered by a preacher. Dr. Martin Luther King spoke after 4 young black girls were killed in the 1963 bombing of a Birmingham church.
And so, my friends, they did not die in vain. God still has a way of wringing good out of evil. And history has proven over and over again that unmerited suffering is redemptive, that in spite of the darkness of this hour, we must not despair, we must not become bitter, nor must we harbor the desire to retaliate with violence. Life is hard, at times as hard as crucible steel. It has its bleak and difficult moments.
But the question is, God,
Why?
why? Somebody want to know why.
Yes, Lord. We need you, Lord. And if one will hold on, he will discover that God walks with him and that God is able to lift you from the fatigue of despair to the buoyancy of hope and transform dark and desolate valleys into sunlit paths of inner peace. And no greater tribute can be paid to you as parents, and no greater epitaph can come to them as children, and where they died and what they were doing when they died. They died between the sacred walls of the Church of God, and they were discussing the eternal meaning of love.
Dr. King had a favorite quote that he repeated often. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. We learned today that the arc is longer than we hoped. The end is not in sight, but the direction is clear. For all
Well, I must tell you that having reviewed that clip prior to tonight's show, I was gripped by emotion, and the empathy was overwhelming because one of the things that as African Americans, particularly African American church, one of the things that we desire to be is we celebrate our heritage, but in our form of worship. But most of us would not mind if our congregations was sprinkled with a little more people from various backgrounds, races, ethnicities, and diversities. And so what I can imagine, Dr. Moss, is that if you would put yourself in the traditional Black church, and you would find yourself celebrating, being happy that you got a guest in Bible study. Because oftentimes in the church in general, midweek service or Bible study is when there's a drop off in attendance.
Yeah.
In many churches, a third or half of the those who are present for Sunday worship make it a Bible study. So here are these folks. Here are these folks, some 10 or more, the average age being 54, who are worshiping and celebrating God. They are following through and being obedient to study the word to show themselves approved unto God and rightly dividing the word of truth. They have committed themselves to being obedient to the Bible, Hebrews 10 and 25, not to take for granted or forsake or devalue the importance of coming together as a family. And here they are coming together to worship God. And then out of nowhere, they are met with this horrific tragedy, this act of evil, one of the worst acts of evil that has ever come upon this nation. And so oftentimes stories are shared and stories are given about persons who have died and people who have died as a result of evil. And really, much is not said about the people and who they were. One of the persons that died was the Reverend Clementa Pinckney. She was a state senator. He was a state senator. He was married. He's a father of 2 children. He graduated in 1995 of Allen University and got his master's degree at the University of South Carolina in 1999. He served in the state legislatures, and he was in the Senate chamber seat just that before. Another person that died was Cynthia Hurd. She was 54, and according to the Charleston Public Library, she was a 31-year employee who managed the John L. Dart Library for some 21 years before heading to St. Andrews Regional Library. She was dedicated to the field of library science. And yet there was another person, a Tawanza Sanders. She was 26 years of age. She was a 2014 graduate from Allen University as well in Columbia, where she obtained a degree in business administration. And most people describe her as being quiet. They called her Ty for sure. And she even worked at Belk's, which is a Southern department store, in Macy's.
Mm-hmm.
There was another person, Ethel Lance, 70 years of age. She had attended Emmanuel, the church, for many years. She worked in a municipal building, and she was often considered to be a very humorous person. And then there was Susie Jackson, and just by her age, 87, we'll call her Mother Jackson, who was Lance's cousin, and she was a lifelong member of the church. There was DePayne Middleton, doctor, he's 49, the mother of 4. She sang in the choir, and she was noted for her warm and sweet personality. There was the Reverend Daniel Simmons, 74 years of age, and he was a pastor at another church in the area. And there was Myra Thompson, 59, She was the wife of a preacher. And then there was the mother of our guest that we have been waiting for, the Reverend Sharonda Coleman Singleton, just 45 years old. She was a pastor at the church, and she was also a speech therapist and track coach. And she did a lot of other things to help youth in the community. So these just weren't church members. These were people who had a life and who had a career, and all they did was show up to the church to enjoy the fellowship of each other and to be spiritually equipped for the work of the ministry. That's why they showed up. And when you look at the range of ages, you can, though we may not have known them personally, you can wrap yourself around the idea of how it was, because we've been in those settings in the church. And so what troubles me, Dr. Moss, when I think about this horrific event, what troubles me and what causes me to question is, from your perspective as a professional, as a clinician, what or who in the world would set out to go and inflict harm on someone in the church?
It's again a very horrific event, and it's not the only event, of course, in our history. And unfortunately, I'm sure that there'll be future events that may be very similar to this. But I think what we see here is a great example of how our culture has the ability to radicalize people who may be susceptible to a lot of hate speech, hate dialogue, hate misinformation, people who unfortunately have at their core a poor sense of self. And so they have to identify with something that they see as strong, as they see as right. And this young man identified with something that was devastatingly, incredibly immoral. And I think that this is a good example of that. And unfortunately, I think that there's a lot more of this going on in our society, even today, 3 to 4 years later.
Well, one of the things that CBS did was try to give us an insight and get us further in the mind of Dylan Roof, who was a neo-Nazi and a confessed white supremacist. So let's watch this clip.
21-year-old Dylan Roof could hear the families, but he could not see them. Bond was set at $1 million on one of the charges. Justice correspondent Jeff Pegues has more from that hearing. Jeff?
Scott, Dylan Roof is being held in a jail cell in a building behind this barbed wire fence. We're told that he's in solitary confinement and under suicide watch.
What is your age?
21.
Dylan Roof stood emotionless as he heard the charges against him. 9 counts of murder for the 3 men and 6 women investigators say he gunned down Wednesday night.
Charleston is a very strong community. We have big hearts.
From the bench, Chief Magistrate James Gosnell expressed sympathy and support for both the victims of the shooting and Roof's family.
We must find it in our heart at some point in time, not only to help those that are victims, but to also help his family as well.
All units responding, 110 Calhoun State.
Active shooter, multiple people down.
New details emerged today about Wednesday's horrific rampage. According to a warrant for his arrest, Roof, seen here on surveillance video, entered Emmanuel AME Church around 8:06 p.m. wearing a fanny pack. After attending a Bible study class for an hour, the court documents say he stood up and pulled out a handgun and began shooting. All 9 victims were shot multiple times. The warrant says that before Roof left, he stood over a witness and uttered a racially inflammatory statement. CBS News has learned Roof told a witness that he had spared her life so she could tell others what happened. In addition to her, a woman and a 5-year-old boy also survived by playing dead. Joseph Riley is the mayor of Charleston, South Carolina.
I knew many of these people. I admired them and loved them and worked with them. And so it's the hardest thing I've done in this job and probably the hardest thing I'll do in my life.
Roof evaded capture for more than 12 hours. According to the warrant, Roof's father and uncle recognized him from the surveillance image released to the public and contacted the Charleston Police Department. Roof's father also told police his son owned a .45 caliber handgun. When Roof was apprehended in Shelby, North Carolina yesterday, law enforcement sources say a Glock 41, a .45 caliber handgun, was found in his car. He was arrested and taken to the Shelby police station.
Why did you do it?
Law enforcement sources say during an interrogation, Roof revealed that he had been planning the attack for some time and that he chose the church because it was an historic African-American church. Sources say he also revealed that while he was sitting in the Bible study, he considered abandoning his plan, but then changed his mind because a source says he thought if he didn't do it, no one else would. If convicted, Roof could get the death penalty. And Scott, we learned today that the Department of Justice is investigating this case as both a hate crime and an act of domestic terrorism.
Jeff Pegues on the investigation for us tonight. Jeff. As the president looked for words to comfort 21-year-old.
Just horrific, just horrific. And though that was some almost 6 years ago, to watch and to view that story, there was for me a freshness. There was, and I have to admit, just by way of transparency, when I viewed it before, it kind of, and I was teary-eyed because, again, when you go to worship or when you show up to church, you're expecting to be sheltered from the ills of society. It's supposed to be a safe place, and this safe place was turned into a crime scene.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to understand, but some people have that much hate toward other people just because they look different.
Mm-hmm.
And your professional career, Dr. Moss, you've maybe as a resident, I've never asked you this question, but in treating people, have you ever came and encountered a patient that when they saw you, it was apparent that hate filled their heart, and that as they looked at you, you treating them was not an option?
You know, I've experienced folks having a great deal of hate. You know, I've been called numerous times racial slurs and the folks that I'm trying to take care of. More so on the inpatient setting where people are hospitalized sometimes and they don't want to be there, and I'm the provider for them. But I've encountered it as well as an outpatient physician. But there's never been a time in which I've been able to excuse myself from their care, because regardless of what someone's ideology is or how much hate they may have and how much they confess that they hate this particular group or they hate me, you know, I still have a calling by God to treat them, you know, and I'm still bound to an oath that says that I have to provide the best care that I can provide them. But yeah, I've experienced it. I have. And, you know, as we think about people who have the level of hate that pushes them to take somebody's life or to take the lives of a number of people, you know, there's one thing that we can, as professionals, agree on, and that is that level of hate has taken the person that they hate and has reduced them to be something less than human. If I can see you as something less than human, then it eases my conscience and my ability to continue to degrade you, to harm you, or even to kill you. When we had the mass lynchings, in the early part of the last century, those people who were hung were looked upon as something that was less than human. And we have a great deal, unfortunately, of rhetoric, of talk that has identified people of color, has identified the transgendered person or the gay person as something as less than human. And as we continue to allow that type of dialogue to take place, we're going to continue to see difficulties with homicides, based upon race, religion, and gender. We're going to continue to see, records set for the amount of hate crimes that are committed in this country. We as a collective have to stand up against radical hate speech, which continues to exist in the echo chambers across this country that unfortunately to many susceptible people creates more Dylan Roofs, and I'm hoping that as we learn more from what we've gained last year, that we can push more dialogue forward to continue to try to eliminate this.
And you mentioned something very interesting because very oftentimes those who commit hate crimes, as you said, they do look at Black folk as being less than human. But not only that, they look at the way they worship God as to be less credible, or that our theology is less credible than theirs. All you have to do is look at the state Senate races in Georgia, where Pastor Warnock, who pastored church to King pastored, how there was an attack on Black liberation theology. And somehow the credibility, are not only the people, but the way they served their God was not as credible on the same scale. And so when you don't value a person or the way they worship God as being on the same plane as yours, then you can not only shoot the people that you don't see as being a valid people, but you can go shoot up their church. You can burn down their church because you don't see them on the same level as who you are and how you worship God. It's interesting to note that during the same period in which the shootings occurred at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, from 2014 to 2018, crime statistics indicate that there was a 35% increase in hate crimes.
Yep. One of the challenges that we've had to kind of support what you're saying is that, there are these, this hate speech that's somewhat on a spectrum, right? And we have a part of this spectrum that unfortunately hijacked some of the pulpits of our churches. And it gave some validation to some of the views that continue to perpetuate hate. And that has been a travesty over the past several years, that we've allowed the church to even get close to the same stream of dialogue as some of this hate speech that we've heard, over the internet, over the radio, on television. And that's a travesty. That's a travesty to the gospel, because then the gospel that we're trying to share to everyone and how they can come and to understand our Lord and Savior hasn't been tainted. And so it's been compromised. So that's been a travesty.
And now there seems to be an attempt to mask it as the patriot faith, the patriot religion, which will soon and may become the Patriot Party. But it's an interesting thing that you and I know that history repeats itself. And one of the travesties that occurred again was that bombing in Birmingham in 1963, in which 4 Black girls were killed. And one of the children that was murdered was a friend of Condoleezza Rice. And so Condoleezza Rice was a part of a memorial. And here are some of her reflections about that horrific event.
They came to Birmingham's 16th Street Baptist Church today to reflect. That Sunday in 1963, love and forgiveness would be put to the test. A bomb planted by a white supremacist ripped through the building. 200 people were inside. 22 were injured. Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, Addie Mae Collins, and Cynthia Wesley, 4 little girls, all under the age of 15, were killed. Former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, a Birmingham native, was a friend of Denise McNair.
I said to my parents as the events were unfolding on television, why do they hate us so much? And I remember my father simply saying, they're hateful men. They're just hateful men.
The horrific attack shocked the nation, making America take a deep look at racial inequality and injustice. It also strengthened the civil rights movement and helped influence the passage of the landmark Civil Rights Bill of 1964. But today in Birmingham, they came to remember.
In looking forward, it is truly that we honor their sacrifice if we remember that equality and justice for all, written in the Constitution, is actually not just a piece of paper, but something that each and every one of us must live each and every day.
4 lives cut short, 4 little girls whose untimely deaths helped change the course of a nation. For CBS News, Natalie Tejeda, Birmingham, Alabama.
Trauma. Trauma as it relates to racism, hate crimes. We as a people have been traumatized. When you think about in the span of history, 50 plus years is not a long time.
No, it's not.
And for all these things to have occurred, trauma has affected us, has affected African Americans disproportionately, if you will, when we look at those in this nation. And when we look at what was driving some of those who stormed the Capitol on January 6, 2021, another horrific event that will now be forever part of this nation's timeline. Many of those who stormed the Capitol, who did it in the name of the outgoing president, in which I will not utter his name, were a part of neo-Nazi groups. They were part of hate groups because somehow they felt as though that their country had been stolen. Never mind the fact that Indians lived here before us, but somehow they were going to take their land back. And so they could not sing, "This land is your land, this land is my land," as J-Lo led in singing that song. They could not say that because this was, they think in their mind, this land. And so as we prepare to close, and we'll probably pick it up a part of this next week, Dr. Moss. As we close, what parting word would you like to offer from your perspective and from your position and from your station in terms of what one could do, an individual, to curb racism and to deal with the temptation of committing a hate crime?
You know, that's a tough way to end, brother. I must say, you know, but one, you know, just being able to see people as people as human beings.
Mm-hmm.
The more that we can see that, and I kind of mentioned this before, the more we can see people as being human beings, the less likely that we are to create hate crimes, and even the less likely we are to discriminate. I do believe that we're at a very unique crossroads. We've had the browning of this country over the past several years. When we think about population, and we think about people who are getting elected, and we think about businesses. So there's a transition that this country is under. And when we have transition, those people who fear loss of status, privilege, power, resources, unfortunately, they go to extreme measures to hold on to that. But what I'm encouraged by is this. Last year, we had many people coming out, marching, protesting, and all of those people were not brown. Those people were all spectrums of the rainbow united together to be able to move the country forward on this dialogue. When we think about what's happened in the most recent election, we've had the greatest turnout in an election in several decades because people want to be involved. I think that there is an opportunity for us to unite.
Yes.
When I say unite, I'm not just talking about brown people. I'm talking about all people, and try to find ways to disenfranchise this hateful speech. And I've had conversation with many people who've had to separate from friends, who've had to separate from families. Big donors have had to separate from various people in office. People are starting to try to find ways to disenfranchise those people who are trying to perpetuate hate.
Yes.
And with that, I am hopeful about a future that this America can have.
Yes, yes, yes. We are hopeful. We are hopeful. One of the rallying cries that has been for African Americans, and certainly I believe the words reflect all immigrants of this nation and all those who are oppressed. James Weldon Johnson wrote, "Lift every voice and sing, till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise, high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea." He continued to write, "Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun, let us march on till victory is won." I believe if we do look at everyone as an equal playing field, as being equal in intelligence, ability, and understand that everyone should be able to go after and have the same opportunities, that victory will be won. Thank you for all of you who have joined with us tonight, for taking sacrifice out of your time. We are hopeful and prayerful that these times are meaningful, and this day of sensationalism and real life shows. We hope that this brings a series of seriousness and focus into your life and gives you some hope. So until next week, on behalf of Dr. Moss, we want to encourage you to feel better. We want to encourage you to become better, and we want to encourage you to live better. Good night, everyone.